Imagine it is the year of our Lord 1212. You are not a king, nor a knight, nor a priest. You are a peasant, tilling a small plot of land in the French countryside near the village of Cloyes. Your hands are calloused, your back aches with a permanent stoop, and your world is defined by the turning of the seasons and the toll of the church bell. Life is a tapestry woven with hardship, faith, and the quiet, desperate hope that your children might see a better world than the one you were born into. But lately, that hope has begun to fray. For generations, you have heard tales of the Crusades, great armies of ironclad nobles and pious kings marching to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem from the Saracens. But the stories that drift back now are not of glorious victory. They are whispers of failure, of greed, of Christian armies turning on each other, sacking the great city of Constantinople instead of fighting the infidel. The Fourth Crusade was a disaster, a perversion of God's will, and the shame of it hangs heavy over Christendom. The priests preach of penance, the nobles count their losses, but you and your kin feel the truth in your bones. The age of heroes has failed. The wealthy and the powerful, with their steel and their strategies, have proven themselves unworthy of God's favor. The world feels broken, caught in a spiritual sickness that no earthly king can cure. Then one spring morning, a new story begins to spread through the villages, a murmur that grows into a torrent. It's not about a king or a knight. It's about a boy, a shepherd boy, no older than your own son, named Stephen. They say he carries a letter written not by a pope or an emperor, but by Jesus Christ himself. You dismiss it at first, another country tale born of superstition and too much cheap wine. But the story persists, and the details are strangely compelling. They say Stephen has a charisma that can calm a frightened horse, a voice that can make grown men weep, and eyes that seem to hold the certainty of heaven itself. He is not just telling a story, he is living a prophecy. One market day, you see him for yourself. He stands on a cart in the village square, a simple shepherd's crook in his hand. He is small for his 12 years, with sun-bleached hair and a face smudged with the dirt of the road. But when he speaks, the entire square falls silent. His voice, clear and high, cuts through the market chatter with an authority that is both terrifying and beautiful. He speaks of his vision, of Jesus appearing to him as a pilgrim and trusting him with a divine mission. The great armies failed, he proclaimed, because their hearts were impure, tainted by greed and violence. But God has chosen a new army, an army of the pure, the innocent, the children. He says they will march to the Holy Land unarmed and unarmored. They will not need swords, for their faith will be their shield. They will not need siege engines, for their innocence will be their battering ram. He tells the crowd that when they reach the Mediterranean Sea, God will part the waters, just as he did for Moses, and they will walk on dry land all the way to Jerusalem. The Saracens, seeing this miracle, will be so moved by the purity of their faith that they will lay down their arms and convert to Christianity on the spot. It is a vision so simple, so audacious, so utterly mad that it should be laughable. But no one is laughing. The crowd is rapt, their faces a mixture of awe and dawning hope. You look at your own children, their eyes wide with wonder, and a cold dread mixes with a spark you haven't felt in years. Could it be true? Could this child, this shepherd boy, be the answer to a generation's prayers? The children's crusade has begun, and it is about to sweep your world into a storm of faith, folly, and unimaginable tragedy. Stephen of Cloyes was not a natural leader in the traditional sense. He possessed no wealth, no title, no military training. What he had was something far more potent in that desperate, God-fearing age: absolute conviction. His belief in his own divine mission was so complete, so unshakable, that it became a force of nature, bending the wills of others to his own. In the weeks following his first sermon, his legend grew with the speed of a wildfire. Every village he passed through added new layers to the myth. They said he could heal the sick with a touch, that birds would land on his shoulders as he spoke, that he could preach for hours without his voice ever tiring. The core of his message was a powerful indictment of the adult world. Your father's crusade was one of sin, he would declare, his voice ringing with a child's simple, brutal honesty. They marched for land and for gold, with pride in their hearts. They carried the cross on their banners, but not in their souls. And so God turned his face from them. This message resonated deeply with a populace disillusioned by the failures of the ruling class. The children, in particular, were captivated. To them, Stephen was not just a preacher, he was a hero, a figure from the Bible stories their priests told come to life. He spoke a language of miracles and divine destiny that made their own small, hard lives seem suddenly full of epic purpose. Soon, children began to leave their homes to follow him. At first, it was just a trickle, a few dozen shepherd boys and farm girls from the villages around Cloyes. But as Stephen's fame spread, the trickle became a flood. They came from all corners of France, some in small, organized groups from their parishes, others alone, having slipped away from their homes in the dead of night. They were a heartbreaking sight, this army of innocents. The youngest were perhaps only 6 years old, barely able to keep up on the dusty roads. The oldest were in their late teens, caught in that uncertain space between childhood and the grim realities of adult labor. Most were peasants, dressed in the rough homespun tunics of their class, but there were also the children of artisans, merchants, and even a few minor nobles swept up in the same wave of fervent belief. Parent reaction was a chaotic mixture of horror, pride, and helpless resignation. Some fathers tried to lock their children away, only to find them gone in the morning, having climbed out of windows or dug their way under doors. Mothers wept and pleaded, but their warnings of starvation and danger were no match for Stephen's promises of divine glory. A chronicler of the time, writing with a tone of bewildered pity, noted, "Fathers and mothers and all their kinsfolk locking their children could not hold them in. For boys and girls leaving their parents ran to these masters. But not all parents resisted. In a world where half of all children died before adulthood, where life was a constant struggle against famine and disease, the idea of a divine mission was for some a comfort. Perhaps it was better for a child to die on a holy quest than to perish from a fever or a bad harvest. Some parents gave their children their blessing, packing them a small parcel of bread and cheese and sending them off with a prayer, believing they were offering their most precious gift to God. Stephen's camp, which grew larger each day, was a world unto itself. It was a chaotic, vibrant, and deeply disturbing society of children. They organized themselves with a surprising degree of efficiency, with older children taking responsibility for the younger ones. They sang hymns as they marched, their high, clear voices echoing across the French countryside. In the evenings, they would gather round campfires to listen to Stephen preach, his words painting vivid pictures of the miracles that awaited them. He was their king, their prophet, their father, all rolled into one charismatic 12-year-old. But beneath the surface of this joyous pilgrimage, the first cracks were already beginning to show. The food they brought from home quickly ran out, and the army of children was forced to depend on the charity of the villages they passed through. At first, people gave freely, moved by the sight of this pious procession. But as the number swelled into the thousands, charity turned to suspicion, and then to outright hostility. A swarm of children, no matter how holy, was a swarm of hungry mouths, a plague of locusts in a land where food was never plentiful. The journey was taking its toll. The younger children struggled to keep pace, their small legs aching, their simple shoes wearing through. Sickness began to spread through the crowded camps. A cough, a fever, a stomach ailment could quickly become a death sentence without proper medicine or care. The children buried their own dead in shallow graves by the side of the road, marking the spots with crude wooden crosses before marching on, their ranks slightly thinned, their hymns a little quieter. As Stephen's army of children swelled, numbering in the tens of thousands by some accounts, it drew the attention of the highest power in the land, King Philip II of France. The king, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, was deeply disturbed by the reports reaching his court in Paris. He saw not a holy pilgrimage, but a massive, uncontrolled social upheaval, a dangerous expression of popular discontent that threatened the stability of his kingdom. He summoned his advisors, a collection of grim-faced bishops and world-weary nobles. "What is the meaning of this madness?" Philip demanded, his voice tight with frustration. "Am I to stand by while the children of France march to their deaths on the word of a shepherd boy?" The bishops were cautious. The movement was clearly born of genuine piety, however misguided. To condemn it outright could be seen as an act against God, potentially sparking even greater unrest. "Your Majesty," one elderly archbishop counseled, "the boy Stephen speaks with a strange power. The common folk believe he is a saint. We must proceed with delicacy." But the nobles were less concerned with theology and more with the practical consequences. "This is a disaster," a powerful duke declared. "These children are abandoning the fields right before the harvest. They are a plague of beggars on the road. This isn't a crusade. It's a rebellion of the young against their elders, against their duties." King Philip, listening to their counsel, made his decision. He would not use force. To send soldiers against an army of children would be a political catastrophe. Instead, he would use the authority of the church and his own royal command. He dispatched messengers to intercept Stephen's crusade with a royal decree. The king, after consulting with the wise masters of the University of Paris and the highest clergy of the realm, commanded all children to abandon their foolish quest and return to their homes. The decree was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. It didn't condemn the children's faith, but rather framed the crusade as ill-timed and unsanctioned. It placed the full weight of both secular and religious authority against a single 12-year-old boy. The royal messengers found Stephen and his followers near the city of Vendôme. The scene that greeted them was one of desperate faith. Thousands of children, their clothes now little more than rags, their faces thin with hunger, were gathered in a field listening to Stephen preach. He stood on a small hillock, his voice carrying over the silent, adoring crowd. When the king's herald, clad in the royal livery, read the decree, a murmur of confusion and anger rippled through the children. Return home? How could they, when they were on the verge of fulfilling God's own command? Stephen listened to the decree with an unnerving calm. When the herald had finished, he raised his shepherd's crook for silence. "The King of France is a good king," he began, his voice filled with a sorrowful pity. "But he is a king of men. He listens to the counsel of worldly men, men who think in terms of armies and harvests. He cannot hear the voice of God as we can." He turned his gaze upon his followers, his eyes burning with conviction. "The king's command is a test of our faith. The devil whispers in the ears of the powerful, trying to turn us from our path. Will you listen to a king of this world, or will you listen to the king of heaven?" The response was a deafening roar of affirmation. The children surged forward, their loyalty to Stephen overriding their fear of the king. The royal heralds, seeing the fanatical gleam in their eyes, wisely chose to retreat. But the king's decree had planted a seed of doubt. The crusade, which had once seemed like a single unified body, began to fracture. Some of the older, more pragmatic children, seeing the logic in the king's command and feeling the gnawing pangs of hunger, began to slip away. They turned back, their dreams of miracles replaced by the simple, desperate need for a roof over their heads and a warm meal. A chronicler noted that the whole business came to nothing. For these children, the crusade was over. They would carry the memory of their great adventure back to their villages, a story to be told with a mixture of pride and embarrassment for the rest of their short, hard lives. However, a significant number, perhaps half of the original host, remained loyal to Stephen. These were the true believers, the ones for whom the crusade had become their entire world. Their defiance of the king had severed their last tie to their old lives. There was no turning back now. Their fate was tied to Stephen's, and their eyes were fixed on the distant promise of the sea. This schism hardened the resolve of those who remained. They were no longer just pilgrims. They were rebels, outlaws in the eyes of their king, martyrs for a cause that only they could understand. Their march south took on a new urgency, a new desperation. They had defied the most powerful man in France. Now they had to prove that their faith was strong enough to justify that defiance. The journey that followed was a descent into a living hell. The charity of the villages they passed through dried up completely. Doors were barred, and the children were met with stones and curses. They were no longer seen as holy innocents, but as a dangerous band of vagrants. Hunger became their constant companion. They ate roots, berries and grass. Some were caught stealing and were beaten or hanged by angry villagers. Disease, fueled by malnutrition and exhaustion, culled their ranks with merciless efficiency. The roadsides became dotted with the small, unmarked graves of children who had marched with dreams of Jerusalem in their hearts, only to find their promised land in a shallow ditch in their own country. John, who had once been Stephen's friend, now watched him with a mixture of awe and growing fear. He saw how Stephen's certainty never wavered, even as the children around him starved. When a young girl collapsed from hunger, Stephen would kneel beside her, not with food, but with a promise. "Take heart, little sister," he would say, his voice soft but firm. "Your suffering is a prayer. God is testing our purity. The hungrier we are, the holier we become. In Jerusalem, we will feast at the Lord's own table." The long march south was a relentless process of attrition, stripping away everything but the hardest core of belief. For every child who fell by the wayside, another seemed to draw a fiercer strength from the suffering. They were no longer an army of innocence. They were a procession of ragged, skeletal ghosts, haunted by the memory of the friends they had buried, and driven forward by a faith that had become as hard and sharp as flint. Stephen himself seemed to transform. The boyish charm was replaced by a gaunt, ethereal intensity. His sermons became more feverish, his prophecies more vivid. He spoke of visions in which angels walked beside them, holding back the forces of darkness that sought to stop them. He claimed that their hunger was a form of spiritual purification, that every pang of starvation brought them closer to God. For many, his words were the only thing keeping them alive. John, now one of the oldest and strongest of the remaining children, found himself in a new role. He was no longer a skeptical friend, but a reluctant lieutenant. He organized the foraging parties, rationed the pitiful supplies of roots and berries they managed to gather, and helped the older children carry the younger ones who could no longer walk. He did these things not out of faith in Stephen's vision, but out of a simple, desperate loyalty to the children themselves. He had to believe that their suffering would have some meaning, even if he no longer believed in the miracle of the parting sea. He watched Stephen, looking for any sign of doubt, any flicker of uncertainty, but he found none. Stephen lived entirely within his vision. The dying children were not a tragedy, they were martyrs. The gnawing hunger was not a sign of failure, it was a mark of divine favor. Finally, after weeks of relentless travel that had blurred into a single nightmare of dust and starvation, they saw it. From the crest of a hill, they looked down upon the city of Marseille, and beyond it, the vast, shimmering expanse of the Mediterranean. A sound went through the ranks of the children, a collective gasp of awe, relief, and terror. This was it, the place where their faith would be tested, the place where God would reveal his power to the world. They camped on the hills overlooking the city, a ragged band of a few thousand survivors from the 30,000 who had started the journey. They were a terrifying sight to the citizens of Marseille. Gaunt, wild-eyed children in filthy rags who spoke of parting the sea as if it were a simple, everyday occurrence. The next morning, Stephen led them down to the harbor. The entire city seemed to have turned out to watch. Merchants, sailors, city guards, and priests lined the waterfront, their faces a mixture of pity, amusement, and morbid curiosity. Stephen walked to the water's edge, his followers pressing in behind him, a silent, expectant mass. He raised his shepherd's crook, just as Moses had raised his staff before the Red Sea. He closed his eyes, his face turned towards the heavens, his lips moving in silent prayer. The crowd held its breath. The children stared at the water, their hearts pounding, with a faith so pure it was almost painful. They waited. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The waves lapped gently against the shore. The sea did not part. A low murmur went through the crowd of onlookers. Some began to laugh. The children looked at each other, their faces filled with a dawning, unbearable confusion. They looked to Stephen, who stood frozen, his arms still outstretched, his eyes wide with a shock that seemed to shatter his very soul. The miracle had failed. God had abandoned them. The silence that fell over the children was terrible than any scream. It was the sound of thousands of hearts breaking at once, the sound of a faith that had sustained them through starvation and death, collapsing into nothing.
In that moment, they were no longer a holy army. They were just lost, hungry children, hundreds of miles from home, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Some fell to their knees and wept with a despair so profound it seemed to drain the very color from the sky. Others simply stood, their faces blank, their eyes empty, unable to process the enormity of their disillusionment. Stephen, for the first time since his crusade began, looked like what he was, a lost, terrified 12-year-old boy. The foundation of his world had been a divine promise, and that foundation had just crumbled into dust beneath his feet. In the depths of their despair, as the children huddled on the shores of Marseille, a new and more insidious form of hope appeared. Two merchants, their names recorded in the chronicles as Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, stepped forward from the crowd of onlookers. They were well-known figures in the city, respected for their wealth and their seemingly pious natures. They approached Stephen, their faces full of a carefully crafted sympathy. "Do not despair, little prophet," Hugh the Iron said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "God works in mysterious ways. Perhaps he did not mean for the sea to part. Perhaps he intended for you to travel on the sea, not through it." William the Pig nodded in agreement. "We are humble servants of the Lord," he declared, his hand placed piously over his heart. "We have 7 ships in the harbor, ready to sail. We will take you and your followers to the Holy Land, free of charge, for the glory of God. It is the least we can do for such faithful children." To the shattered and desperate children, these words were a lifeline, a new miracle sent to replace the one that had failed. A wave of relief and gratitude swept through them. Their faith, so brutally tested, was instantly rekindled. Of course, this was the true test. God had not abandoned them. He had merely chosen a different method for their journey. Stephen, his spirit reignited, embraced the merchant's offer with tears of joy. He saw it as a divine vindication, a sign that his mission was still blessed. He turned to his followers, his old charisma returning in a rush. "Behold," he cried, his voice ringing with renewed conviction, "God has sent us our own fleet. He has provided for us just as I promised." The children cheered, their despair forgotten in a new wave of euphoria. They swarmed around the merchants, kissing their hands and thanking them as saviors. Only a few, like Jean, felt a knot of unease. He looked at the merchants' faces, at their soft hands and expensive robes, and saw not piety but a cold, calculating opportunism. There was something in their smiles that didn't reach their eyes, a predatory gleam that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. But his whispered warnings were lost in the chorus of joyous celebration. Within days, the children were herded onto the 7 ships. The conditions were appalling. They were packed into the dark, foul-smelling holds with barely enough room to lie down. The food was scarce and of poor quality, stale biscuits and brackish water. But their spirits were high. They were finally on their way to the Holy Land. They sang hymns on the decks, their voices carrying across the water, full of a hope that was as tragic as it was beautiful. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came 2 days into the voyage. A violent storm descended upon the fleet, scattering the ships across the churning sea. 2 of the vessels were driven onto the rocks of San Pietro Island off the coast of Sardinia. They sank with all hands, taking hundreds of children to a watery grave. The survivors, who later washed ashore, were the lucky ones. For the children on the remaining 5 ships, a far worse fate awaited. The storm passed and the voyage continued, but they were not sailing towards the Holy Land. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig were not pious benefactors. They were slave traders. Their plan, from the moment they saw the desperate children on the shore of Marseille, was a masterpiece of predatory evil. They sailed not east to Acre, but south, across the Mediterranean, to the coast of North Africa. The children, who knew nothing of geography or navigation, were oblivious to the betrayal until they saw the strange, sun-baked architecture of the port of Bougie in what is now Algeria. There, the terrible truth was revealed. The ships were met not by fellow Christians, but by Saracen slave merchants. The children, weak from the voyage and shattered by the realization of their betrayal, were herded off the ships and onto the auction blocks of the city's slave market. Their crusade, which had begun with the vision of converting the Saracens through faith, had ended with them being sold to the Saracens as property. The scene in the slave market was the final brutal negation of their holy mission. The children were stripped, examined like livestock, their teeth checked, their muscles prodded. They were sold off in small groups, their cries and pleas ignored by men who saw them not as holy pilgrims, but as valuable commodities. They were sold to the governor of Alexandria, others to masters throughout the caliphate. A few, according to one account, were taken as far as Baghdad, where they were bought for the caliph's own court. They were valued for their youth, their European features, and the skills some of them had learned in their former lives. They became servants, laborers, and concubines, their dreams of a holy crusade replaced by the grim reality of a life in bondage. Their faith, the very thing that had driven them across a continent, was now a liability. They were forced to convert to Islam, their Christian names replaced with Arabic ones, their last connection to their former lives systematically erased. The story doesn't end there. A few of the children, through luck or resilience, managed to survive and years later tell their story. One priest who had accompanied the crusade out of a sense of duty was one of the few who was eventually freed. He made his way back to Europe and told the tale of the merchant's betrayal and the children's enslavement. His account, recorded by a chronicler, is one of the few first-hand sources we have for the tragic end of Stephen's crusade. He reported that of the thousands of children sold, the vast majority were never heard from again. They were swallowed by the great, anonymous machine of the medieval slave trade, their individual fates lost to history. He did note, however, that even in bondage, some of the children held on to their faith with the tenacity that impressed their captors. He spoke of a group of them who were martyred for refusing to renounce their Christian beliefs, their final act a testament to the powerful, if tragically misguided faith that had led them from their homes in the first place. The story of the Children's Crusade doesn't end neatly. Like many events from the distant past, it is a mosaic of fragmented accounts, clerical condemnations, and folk memory. The version we have just explored, centered on the French shepherd boy, Stephen of Cloyes, is the most dramatic and well-documented of the phenomena that swept Europe in 1212. But it was not the only one. At the same time, in the Rhineland region of Germany, a similar movement was taking shape, led by a boy named Nicholas of Cologne. Nicholas, like Stephen, was a charismatic child who believed he had a divine mission. His message, however, was slightly different. He did not speak of parting the sea, but of a more peaceful conversion. He preached that they should march south, over the Alps and into Italy. Once there, he promised they would find their way to the Holy Land and achieve through innocence what the armies of knights could not. Tens of thousands of German children and poor adults joined his procession. Their journey was, if anything, even more horrific than that of their French counterparts. To reach Italy, they had to cross the treacherous barrier of the Alps. They were ill-equipped for the journey, with no proper shoes or warm clothing. They starved and froze in the mountain passes, their path marked by the bodies of the weak. Those who survived the Alpine crossing arrived in the Italian city of Genoa, a ragged and depleted force. The city authorities, alarmed by this sudden influx of foreign beggars, gave them a stark choice: either find work within the city or leave. The promised miracle, the path to the Holy Land, did not materialize. Disillusioned and leaderless, Nicholas's crusade dissolved. Some of the children did manage to find work in Genoa, their old lives in Germany gone forever. Others continued on to Pisa, where 2 ships offered them passage. Their fate is unknown. They may have been shipwrecked or, like Stephen's followers, sold into slavery. Nicholas himself survived the initial collapse of his movement. He led a small band of his most loyal followers to Rome, seeking the Pope's blessing. The Pope, Innocent III, was a man of deep piety, but also a shrewd political operator. He was moved by the children's faith, but horrified by the tragedy. He met with Nicholas, praised his zeal, but absolved the children of their crusade vows and ordered them to return home. For most, this was an impossible command.
Their homes were hundreds of miles away. Across the Alps, they had barely survived once. Many of the German children simply faded into the population of Italian cities, becoming beggars and servants. Their great crusade, a bitter memory. Nicholas himself is said to have died on the return journey, another young victim of a faith that the world was not ready for. So, what are we to make of these strange, tragic events? Were the Children's Crusades genuine expressions of popular piety, or were they something else entirely? Modern historians have moved away from a purely religious interpretation. They point to the social and economic conditions of the early 13th century. This was a time of significant social upheaval. The population was growing, but land was scarce, leading to widespread poverty and the sense of hopelessness among the peasantry. The established feudal order seemed to be failing, and the church itself was struggling with internal corruption and dissent. In this context, the Children's Crusades can be seen not just as a religious movement, but as a social protest, a rebellion of the dispossessed. They were, perhaps, a mass movement of the poor and marginalized who, having no future in their own society, embraced a radical, desperate vision of a better world. The children who marched were likely not just young innocents, but a broader cross-section of the rural poor, including teenagers and young adults, for whom the term for child in Latin, pueri, could also mean the poor or the powerless. The story of the merchants who offered passage only to sell the children into slavery has a basis in historical reality. The Mediterranean in the 13th century was a hotbed of piracy and slave trading. Christian and Muslim powers were officially at war, but merchants from both sides regularly engaged in a brutal but profitable trade in human beings. It is entirely plausible that opportunistic traders would see a mass of desperate, leaderless children as a source of easy profit. The tragedy of the Children's Crusade, then, is not just a story of misguided faith. It is a story of how faith can be born from despair and how that faith can be exploited by the cynical and the powerful. Stephen and Nicholas, whether they were true mystics or simply charismatic children, tapped into a deep well of popular discontent. They gave a voice to the voiceless and a purpose to the purposeless. But their innocence was no match for the harsh realities of the world. The legacy of the Children's Crusade is a dark and cautionary one. It became a byword for naive, doomed enterprises. The Church, in its official histories, downplayed the events, embarrassed by a popular movement that it could neither control nor condone. But the story lived on in folk memory, a tragic tale of lost innocence that was told around firesides for generations. It reminds us that the most powerful movements can be born from the humblest of origins, that faith without wisdom can be a destructive force, and that the young and the innocent are often the first victims in a world run by the old and the cynical. When we look back at that spring of 1212, at the fields of France and Germany teeming with children marching towards a promised miracle, we see a moment of pure, unadulterated hope, a belief that the world could be remade, that the sins of the fathers could be washed away by the innocence of their children. The failure of that hope, its brutal collision with the realities of geography, politics, and human greed, is one of history's most heartbreaking lessons. The sea did not part. The Saracens did not convert. The children did not reach their holy land. Instead, they found their end in the cold waters of the Mediterranean, on the desolate slopes of the Alps, and in the slave markets of North Africa. Theirs was a crusade not of victory, but of suffering, a pilgrimage that ended not in salvation, but in a profound and tragic silence.